Welcome to Grokchain Conversations. This podcast is presented by a multidisciplinary group of legal, financial, and technology professionals to meet and discuss today's most pressing questions around the use and governance of the blockchain. Through roundtable dialogue, we will provide listeners with a full spectrum of views on where this technology is today and where it might be leading. The information provided on the Grokchain Conversations is for educational purposes only. The information provided does not constitute legal, investment, financial, tax, accounting, or any other professionally licensed advice. The views expressed here are those of the individuals, not those of their respective employers or Grokchain.
So welcome to this episode of Grokchain. In this one, we're going to do like a fairly lengthy sort of discussion into what Tgrade is as a blockchain and go into quite a lot about the mechanics of how it works, how it came about, and what it's supposed to do. So we'll start with introductions. So I'm being joined, I'm Martin Warner, and I've been joined by Amila. So maybe Amila, you could do an introduction of who you are.
I'm Amila Kulasinghe. I'm a board member at Ocean Blue. I've been working in the crypto and blockchain space since 2016 as a legal, regulatory, and business structuring advisor. I work with startups in the space and also on law reform and regulatory reform initiatives. Based in the UK, and prior to working in the crypto space, I worked in financial markets for over a decade, both on the legal side and on the business side as well. My area of specialism was prime brokerage and custody. And I worked on advising banks and asset managers around safeguarding assets and trading services across mainstream financial markets. And the work that I do now in the crypto asset space very much parallels that.
Yeah, so my background is one of the co-founders of Confio, one of the people behind the design and the business side of Tgrade with my colleagues. I come from a capital markets and technology background and got into blockchain in 2017. So I spent the last however many years in various projects in the blockchain space, and in 2020 founded Confio and the Ocean Blue Foundation. So I guess we both come from the financial markets background. We've both got many years in the blockchain space of projects. We, I guess, share the experience of supporting financial businesses or financial service businesses, should I say, in a very regulated global markets. And I guess we both share that experience of how financial services actually work in practice in these global markets, and all the inefficiencies, the reliance on really old technology. Things have been patched and patched and patched over years, not just in technology, but also, I think, to some extent by the regulations. Regulations tend to respond to crisis. So, the last major one was 2008-9. There was a lot of legislation came off the back of that about capital requirements for banks, about liquidity, and so on and so forth. So that's a good example of what the legislation follows. And if you can think of capital markets being quite mature in terms of regulation over many centuries, then we have this very, very dense layer of regs over a business. And strangely enough, the repeal of old legislation tends to be a lot slower than the implementation of new ones. So that's the kind of the world we come from. What motivates us both, I guess, is a shared interest and the potential to solve real world business problems, particularly in regulated markets.
So I completely agree with that, Martin. And I think, so you and I first met a number of years ago on the London blockchain meetup scene. And I think given our shared background in financial markets, we were very well aware of the challenges that face businesses that operate globally, but often are subject to a patchwork of national regulations. And I think we were also very much aware of the inefficiencies that bedevil the financial sector because of legacy technology infrastructure and the limitations that imposes upon businesses operating in financial markets. And I think both of us were excited about the potential for blockchain technologies and how they could help drive innovation and revolutionize that infrastructure, and also how they could be the basis for providing a more efficient technology foundation for real-world business applications. And I think that's what first got us talking about what we saw as being some of the challenges faced when trying to build a solid and effective responsive technology foundation for regulated businesses. And when we started exploring as well, what were the requirements of real-world businesses that blockchain technologies could fulfill. And so yes, that's what first led us to discuss about potential opportunities for collaboration, and ultimately has led us to work together at Ocean Blue and support the development of the Tgrade network. So perhaps that's a good point for Martin, you to just give us an overview about the setup at Ocean Blue and how it relates to and how it's supporting the development of the Tgrade network.
So yeah, the context is like Tgrade is a sovereign level 1 blockchain built on the Cosmos stack. But before we dive into what it actually does, we should take a bit of time just to introduce the various entities around that, because you can, in theory, just collaborate on the open source tools, build a blockchain, launch it, and you don't necessarily need a legal entity behind it. But we felt it's important to have the right legal entity behind the blockchain to do these things correctly if we were going to be in the regulated space. So we did quite a bit of research on what type of legal entity we want behind a decentralized platform that we aim to build. And we came up with a legal entity based in the Netherlands, known as a foundation or a stichting, and the Dutch term for it. And what a stichting is the foundation is a very nice legal structure in the fact that it has no end beneficiaries, no shareholders, and therefore very, very good as a legal basis for launching something decentralized that hasn't really got an owner or hasn't really got any controlling entities. It's run by a board, and both Amila and I sit on the board of Ocean Blue, and it has, like every foundation, it has a purpose, and the purpose is in supporting development and research in open source public networks, focusing on real-world business applications, regulated markets, governance issues, legal and regulatory policy reform, and development. We have a strong board of active participants who come from very different backgrounds, so from technology, product, business, legal, and regulatory. So I think it's an important part of the board to make these correct decisions about, how we structure various things about, behind the blockchain, how do we launch things formally, how do we get all legal agreements in place without creating any centralization by the back door. So we're kind of the guardians that run the foundation, which is the entity behind the blockchain. The first, obviously, it's a very generic purpose, and the first major project we funded and supported was the development of Tgrade through grants to Confio. And I should probably do a mention there what Confio is. Confio is a Berlin software house. It is basically the company behind CosmWasm, which is the Cosmos smart contracting engine, and a number of other open source significant contributions to the Cosmos ecosystem. So the people involved there are Ethan Frey, who's the architect of CosmWasm, Simon Water, who is also a key part of developing that whole library in between the blockchain and the web backends, as it were, so like the TypeScript libraries. That basically brings the blockchain to life by yeah, sort of like almost like the Web3 hooks. I know I'm not really supposed to use that word, but it you know, allows applications to be built on top of the chain securely. And Simon's a strong cryptographer and understands the maths and all that kind of thing. So it's important to have someone like that in charge of building that framework. CosmWasm, the smart contracting engine, is.
And for the benefit of listeners who aren't particularly familiar with the Cosmos ecosystem and with CosmWasm in particular, could you explain what CosmWasm is, and also its relevance and importance to the DeFi sector in particular?
I mean, CosmWasm came about through, I think it was a hackathon where it was born in Berlin a few years ago. And the reasoning behind it was the WASM Rust technology sort of layer was quite attractive as a way of building up the smart contract ecosystem. And there were a lot of lessons to be learned from Ethereum and Solidity about you know, where the attack vectors were. How could we close some of those down? And so it was designed that way from the ground up. And the idea with a WASM is that you can compile smart contracts into the WASM using, like we code mainly in Rust, but you can also use other languages as long as it compiles into the Rust engine, and it can run from there. So that was one of the things, that it could support multiple programming languages, but the design was very much focused on making it secure.
So you mentioned there that existing and widely used smart contracting languages on networks such as Ethereum are prone to certain vulnerabilities and deficiencies, and that CosmWasm was specifically designed to either eliminate or reduce the efficacy of those attack vectors. Could you elaborate on that a bit and explain the particular features of CosmWasm that address those deficiencies?
I think there's a long list. We had something like 17 different vulnerabilities that are known within Solidity and Ethereum. So one of the things about Solidity, it's a great smart contracting language that people can pick up very quickly. The syntax is kind of familiar to a lot of JavaScript developers. However, it's very hard to write a very secure, good contract, because there are things, the way it's been designed, that leave kind of attack vectors that are well understood, that if you know about them, you can code and make sure that you shut those down. But that relies on you as a coder to be able to do that. And the design of CosmWasm was to not even allow you to compile a contract that had these attack vectors in there. So it was a way that, you know, we've seen in DeFi protocols that get hacked, someone's left a vulnerability in a smart contract that maybe even an auditor, if they have been audited, missed, and then the funds get drained because they find a way of doing like recursive attacks. So when these things are known about and we can find ways of coding them out, which is exactly what happened in CosmWasm, you can't actually do some of these attacks because you're not even allowed to compile the contract in the first place. So the developer has that safeguard in, they don't have to think about, oh, I wonder if I need to test this scenario and that scenario where there's known vulnerabilities. If you can code them out through the architecture, then that's the best way to do it. In terms of the early days, Terra took a fork, and they cracked on and built it. And you know, the whole Terra ecosystem, the Anchor protocol, grew huge with a massive TVL and AUM at one point, until obviously things caught up on themselves later. But that didn't really diminish CosmWasm as a product at all. It's, you know, it's gone from strength to strength. It's being used by a lot of chains now. A lot of them are in the process of implementing it. It's being constantly improved. There's a very good community around it, and it's only going to get even better through the way that Cosmos works, through the interchain connections that they have. So Cosmos really is an internet of blockchains. So the sovereign chains can connect to each other through a thing called IBC, and CosmWasm will become multi-chain. So you can then sort of almost create composite applications using these native applications or native chains. So say you have one chain that does identity well, you can connect to there to get credentials, run part of your smart contract there, go to another one that maybe does Oracle services and another one that does something else, and then onto your chain to do another bits and pieces. And it all works seamlessly without any dodgy bridges. It just connects back and forth. People run relays, you pay your tokens or your fees, and it goes. So I think that's why it's a really, really solid platform to build on, and it's given us a lot of flexibility when we've been building Tgrade to have this engine behind it.
You mentioned that the focus of Tgrade was designing a blockchain network that was capable of supporting real-world business applications and also highly regulated environments such as financial markets. What are the key features, in your view, that a blockchain network needs to possess in order to be able to support real-world business applications?
Start right at the bottom. So if we start discussing like the layers that make it up onto ultimately where a business will run the applications. So we touched briefly on the foundation earlier as the legal entity. So we start with very clear legal entities on what's behind the chain. So who's actually launching this chain? So it's a foundation in in a country with a good legal standing in Europe, and it's been built by a reputable company that also does a lot of other software that is relevant to the Cosmos ecosystem. So that's kind of the really, really basic one. So the next level, I think, if you're looking at businesses, I think we've had debates about public versus private blockchains, which we maybe come on to later, but certainly our view is that a public chain is the correct way to do things for all sorts of reasons. So I think the main difference between the two is when you develop in the public, open source, fully distributed, decentralized world, you're operating in a very hostile environment. And hostile is good. It's an opportunity because it means that every single piece of your operation gets probed, gets pushed for software vulnerabilities, for economic vulnerabilities, for unintended consequences in the design, the economics, the tokenomics, and so on. So people are constantly trying to game your system, to break it, to attack it. What that means is that you end up something very robust, very secure, and very reliable. I'm not saying it hasn't got any holes in it, but there's always people out there looking for those, and then there's ways to fix it, to react to that, to make sure that you've got something very strong and resilient. And I think that contrasts with what you see with outside of blockchain in terms of networks, where maybe you're operating using one of the major cloud providers. What happens if they have an outage? Are their interests aligned in the same way? Obviously, resiliency is important because they sign SLAs with their customers, but it's not really the same level of integrity that you get through this constant probing and attacking of your systems that you get. And yes, admittedly, the cloud companies' data centers will also be under attack, but not to the same degree that the software that they're running, the underlying software, gets attacked as well as you will see on a blockchain. So that was the first part. I think the way we've designed it, we will come on to later on the consensus mechanism that we're using. So we built on top of the Tendermint, Cosmos SDK stack, and CosmWasm. It's a well-known technology. It runs many blockchains as the Tendermint, CosmWasm. I've seen numbers of throughput of 10,000 TPS, which I think is a controlled experiment, but it kind of gives you the idea of the speed that you could run these chains at. It's not the fastest, but then we know fast networks compromise security. So it's kind of the balance that we have. We've also, obviously, we're running a Byzantine fault tolerant chain, means that you have instant finality. You don't have to wait for the proof of work type of waiting for lots of confirmations before you can actually or sort of layers in the chain before you can really be sure of something. And then I guess what we also did in Tgrade is made a conscious decision that we wanted to have some form of mechanism to bring in identity around addresses. So in the fully decentralized, fully pseudo-anonymous environment, there's the ultimate freedom to do anything without consequences, but that's not necessarily well reconciled back to what businesses, the environment businesses operate in. Businesses are registered in countries, they have obligations, legal obligations, regulations that they have to comply with, and that doesn't really tie back to a free-for-all kind of maritime law that we see in open blockchains.
I think that's a really interesting point. Open blockchains, as you say, provide a highly adversarial environment, and real-world businesses and the technology applications for real-world businesses are highly complex. And having an opportunity to test that complexity and build resilience over time is, I think, one of the great benefits of being able to access and utilize open blockchain technologies. However, many industries, particularly those that function in regulated markets, when participants in those industries look to incorporate blockchain technologies into their infrastructure, their first port of call is often to turn to private permission chains. And yet, as you rightly say, private permission chains do not in any way incorporate the same type of hostile environment that can be so beneficial to developing security and resiliency in complex applications over time. So for real-world businesses, regulated markets, their requirements in many ways seem fundamentally contradictory to the design objectives and the philosophy of open blockchains. So with that in mind, how does Tgrade address that contradiction? How does it square that circle?
It's the point that we wrestled with for a long time on reconciling this, that the decentralization is the main point of a blockchain. We have a decentralized network. So you have to be very careful when you design things to match that with the business needs of control. So how do we build that in without centralizing by the back door? That was a big question that we asked ourselves. At what point, at what level of the blockchain do we do this at? We had a look to see what other people were doing and what ideas people had, because blockchains are open source. You can check things out. You can look at what people are doing. You can see what approach the industry's been taking. And interestingly, there were chains that were looking to tackle something similar, but what they did was focus in on a particular jurisdiction. They introduced KYC and AML on chain, connected, heavily embedded in their systems, either at the chain level or in the application level. So, we saw with great fanfare Aave Pro partner with Fireblocks. They selected one KYC provider to create their institutional version of Aave, so you could then participate in DeFi as an institution, having gone through the KYC AML checks. However, it felt a bit brittle, and with the background in capital markets, we know, we certainly experienced this, that you kind of start with one jurisdiction, and then when you try and map it to another one, there's a little subtle difference, and then there's another little subtle difference, and we do this differently in Tokyo, and this doesn't quite work in Singapore the same way as you do it in Frankfurt, and then you could try in Chicago, and then, oh God, we've got an inference engine, we've got massive layers of complexity, and we've got edge cases, and it all looks a bit horrible. So taking a step back, saying, well, we know that this is important. How do we create an environment where all that process that already exists, all regulated businesses have a very, I would say quite a deep commitment to compliance. They have to by law. They've invested in platforms, people, processes, databases, policy, the whole lot. We don't need to reproduce that on blockchain. Tempting as it is, that we can do better. Let's just say that financial institutions, businesses in general, don't really thank you for reproducing services, processes they've already got that doesn't really add any value. So let's leave that there. And we said, okay, we'll do this at the protocol level using governance. So let's have a way of off-chain of linking identity with a public with a blockchain address, and let's say, okay, we've got that link now. And the governance tools that we built was around being able to create groups of these identified addresses that you keep a record of. Every time you add these addresses on, there's a record of who added them, when they were added. It's public, it's transparent, and you know how these groups can get created. So we allow the tools for anyone to create a whitelisted group. Now, the thinking was, because the compliance is done, the checking is done, the ongoing monitoring is done off-chain through existing processes, it can be very flexible. So we can say sophisticated market makers want to get together and do an over-the-counter derivative system together and trade all sorts of off-exchange, I don't know, let's call them overnight swaps or something. And they can do that. And they can do all the processes, legal things off-chain, form the agreements, map the addresses, create these whitelisted groups, issue the digital versions of overnight swaps and carry on trading. That's all perfectly good. That doesn't affect anyone else in Tgrade. That's their business. It's self-sovereign. They can do that. And I think that's the important part. You may then also get somebody with a much less formal need. They create a group to trade, say, in a country where identity maybe isn't as well established. Maybe not everyone has a passport, a birth certificate, but they vouch for each other and say, well, yeah, it's my auntie's best friend from school. I vouch for her, and so on. And that's how you can also create a group. So you have that full flexibility and range. But what unifies them is, one, it's self-sovereign. Two, the governance is there under strict. You set the terms of how you run the groups, what you issue in there, but you can have the granularity to set the permissions and do it yourself. And I think that is the way that you create marketplaces, you create an environment that businesses have control. They don't need permission from Tgrade, Ocean Blue, Confi, or anybody to be able to do this. You need to obviously invest time in setting it up. That's a business decision. And you need some tokens to pay for native transactions, but that's about it. But the control is you as a business.
That's a very interesting point. I think you're right that real world businesses, one of their fundamental requirements is a need to know, particularly in regulated markets, who they're interacting with, knowing the identity of their counterparties. And furthermore, where you have businesses that are operating globally, they have to deal with the challenge of navigating through a patchwork of national regulatory frameworks that will have different requirements around the types of institutions they can interact with and how they can interact with them. So the fact that Tgrade incorporates powerful tools that allow businesses to navigate the requirements of national regulations within a global business, I think is a very compelling aspect to the capabilities of the network. In addition, you mentioned that with a lot of traditional public open blockchains, there are problems due to their pseudonymous nature of the risk of market abuse and market manipulation. And a particular requirement of regulated businesses often is that they need to operate in markets that are reliably safe, secure, and free of manipulation. And again, the fact that trusted circles as a byproduct makes it much harder to engage in the types of market abuse and manipulation that we have seen develop through the rise of pseudonymous open blockchains. Again, is I think a very powerful aspect of the capabilities of the Tgrade network.
The trusted circles, to sort of finish it off, is really basically by providing this whitelisting group, the trusted circles and the governance around that, you're then creating. You can go back to regulators and say, look, we know who's in our group. There's also a way it mitigates it wasn't really by design, but as a byproduct of this, you can actually mitigate market manipulation and abuse. So if you know address XYZ is doing something bad, you've got rules around that. You can censor them, you can identify them. And I think that's really important, because you've seen the rise of minor extractable value, which is otherwise known as front running and not very palatable in normal markets, quite openly going on in blockchains. And that kind of activity can't happen in a trusted circle, because you can't have an outsider sandwiching or front running your orders in collusion with the validator, because they're not a member of your trusted circle. They can't deal in the digital assets that you've issued in your trusted circle. If you are in a trusted circle and you do get involved in things like sandwiching, front running, then we know who you are, we know where you live, and we can come after you. So I guess it's a nice byproduct of the trusted circles, that transparency within a group, yet it's still private as well on the chain. So you still see it anonymous, and no one really knows who is behind that address. You just know that that address belongs to that trusted circle, or many trusted circles. Yeah, I think there's a lot of features when you start really looking how trusted circles can work, and around market discipline, I think is will become very important. I know the regulators are looking about how securities will work properly on chain, and reporting mechanisms. So I think this kind of ties in and is almost putting the groundwork forward for regulators to be able to monitor these trusted circles in real time themselves, to see that people are behaving correctly. And if they can see abuse going on, they can then go straight back and censor the participants. And I think that could transform the way we do regulatory reporting. So rather than all the intermediaries having to collect the data, file it to the regulator, then has to reassemble it, when you've got the source of truth as a public open chain, the regulator can then say, well, okay, so what trusted circles are you running? What comes under my jurisdiction? And you can have some kind of disclosure there, and they can monitor that data at source, rather than waiting for it to trickle through and then run reports and figure it out for themselves. So I think the trusted circles is really a nice foundation for starting businesses, and we're starting to see like this is the first step of the kind of the ecosystem. And I think some of the other things that we're seeing being developed on Tgrade is Nimlab company Milan have built this what they call an enterprise wallet. So it's a smart contract wallet with kind of institutional friendly features on it. So what that means is that custody of assets is very important. So when we're looking at custody, the early ways of doing custody was using hardware wallets, cold storage, and ways of managing that, which is quite expensive, quite cumbersome way of doing things. Or the alternative is USB type sticks like Ledger or Trezor, or browser extensions, or a combination of both of them. None of them are particularly friendly for businesses. So what a smart contract wallet does, and the enterprise features they brought in, is things like they've got social recovery in there. So you can imagine an institutional setting where the associate has one part of the key, the VP who runs the department has another part of it, and the MD has another part. So if a customer loses everything, they haven't lost all their assets, and they don't have to necessarily write down recovery phrases, but you can recover from the fragments. So you then ask the associate, send his bit in, the VP and the MD, to recreate the customer's keys, which then can be recovered. So it's that kind of attention to what's actually needed for a business is important. And these are the tools that are being built for Tgrade, or on Tgrade, to support businesses. And we hope that, or we're confident in time, that there'll be other applications that dovetail into that. And we're talking to a couple of kind of stable coins with a regulatory twist on them as well. So we can see that coming on board. That will ease the on and off ramp of the money. We've got somewhere safe to secure them. Then the businesses can focus on what they want to do from business logic, what smart contracts they need to do, how to tie that and link it into their existing applications.
Gives a very helpful overview of the tools and controls that are available at the localized market level that allow market participants to construct transaction environments where they have control over the identities of the entities that are interacting with them, and also control the extent to which assets, representations of value can move around between them. If we take a step back and zoom out from the focus of the previous discussion on localized markets, and think about system-wide features, perhaps we can talk next about some of the key design objectives and features of the underlying network. So Tgrade has taken a different approach to a lot of the public blockchains that are currently operating in the industry in terms of consensus, governance, engagement. So perhaps you can elaborate a little bit on that and the thinking behind some of the distinctive approaches that Tgrade have adopted in structuring those elements of the network.
Basically, just to repeat what you're saying there, we sort of laid out what the business rationale is for Tgrade as itself, who we're aiming this at, what tools we built, and to some extent, the importance of the consensus mechanism, the governance, becomes very, very significant if we're asking businesses, say, particularly financial institutions, to mint or issue possibly millions or billions of dollars worth of assets on our chain. How on earth do we secure these? So what have we done? What work did we do under the bonnet with the consensus engines and the governance on it? So we thought very hard about this question very, very early on, probably even before, in fact, before we started the company, we were already discussing these things about consensus design. And we began by looking, or just asked the question, probably, I don't know, maybe even 4 or 5 years ago, if we could design a consensus mechanism from the ground up, what would it be? What would we base it on? So we looked at very briefly at proof of work, and then we concentrated more on the proof of stake, which is what the Cosmos ecosystem runs in, because we were working in that space. And there are many advantages to proof of stake, as we've all recently learned from the merge, that uses far less electricity for the securing of the network. We don't have to have the proof of work mechanism churning lots and lots of CPUs to figure out answers to secure it. There's some positives about proof of work, but proof of stake seemed to be better towards what we need to do for business throughput and security and so on. So based on proof of stake, there's things we liked and some things we didn't like. So things we don't like about proof of stake is you have potential for concentration of voting power. And that happens when you get large validators being the centralized exchanges. So they offer staking services at Coinbase, at Kraken, at Bitstamp, and so on. And basically, these centralized exchanges aggregate all their customers' positions and they go and stake them. But it's the entity doing the staking, the Binance, the Kraken, the Coinbase, that has the voting power. And you can look at some proof of stake chains and you see the top 10 validators are 8 of those 10 could be centralized exchanges. And they have a disproportionate voting power because they hold so many tokens. So that kind of flies in the face a little bit of decentralization. So we thought, well, there's a couple of issues here about concentration of power, and the way that the delegated proof of stake works. So I'll come on to the delegations in a minute, but I'll start with the thinking behind adapting proof of stake. So what we decided that would make a most decentralized chain. So the objective was to have different types of validators, different sizes, different geographies, and have it as decentralized as possible. So how do you achieve that? So what we thought was the most secure blockchains, they work off a very tight community. So you need to provide incentives around community engagement. That's the first thing. Because if everyone's actively looking after a chain rather than just running a data center, having a few alerts, and they're actively building things, then you get a stronger chain for it. They're looking at ways to improve all the time. So that was one of the factors. The second one was if you're looking at the different size of validators, how do you encourage smaller validators who may be small today but could be larger ones tomorrow? So we don't want to just be reliant on the established players and have almost like incumbent validators who have authority through reputation and so on. But we need to open up the door to innovation, to have smaller ones to give them a chance. So we wanted to include them somehow. So what we did was came up with this idea of proof of engagement. So there's a self-sovereign committee that look at engagement. They figure out who's doing what. They ask the community to submit applications for engagement. And what we mean by engagement is, say, a validator writes a lovely dashboard or puts like a knowledge base together for other validators, or they help out by building a block explorer or something like that from a technical point of view, or they just encourage good quality validators to come on. There's all sorts of mechanisms they can do. They can also get involved in community initiatives, in video promoting and that kind of thing. So by that design is that engagement creates a number of points, and the points relate to the distribution of block rewards. So as a validator, you get engagement points, which means that your stake plus engagement points gives you a voting authority, plus you get paid out the reward in the distribution through the engagement points. One of the design mechanisms that we did put in place for the engagement points was not that you can come in all enthusiastic, you knock out 5 really good projects, get involved in a YouTube campaign, and you say, right, I've earned my points, now I'm going to sit back and relax and take the money. There's a half-life involved. So every 180 days, your points half. The reason for that is to give you a medium time frame, not just to do the quick wins, but you can continue earning, but it starts diminishing over time. So you need to keep hustling. You need to keep earning those points. So I think that's what makes incentivizes everyone in the community to take part. And it's not only just open to validators, there's also anyone in the community that makes a contribution can earn these rewards. So if, for example, you're out hustling and you go to business meetups and you talk to business, say, have you ever thought about building on blockchain? And they build on Tgrade and you introduce them, you're a candidate for engagement points and you earn tokens. Everyone wins. So that was the first kind of part of the mechanism that we've got this adaptation of proof of stake. We then introduced a sigmoid curve, which is basically the rewards go up based on stake plus engagement points, and at some point they flatten. So we don't get a whale coming in, dumping a load of tokens, saying, oh, forget the engagement points, I just want to earn the tokens by popping in a large stake. It doesn't work after a certain point. There's no incentive for you to do so. You don't get a return. Now, the other thing with engagement points, we're also linking it a little bit to identity. So when you apply for points, or when we go looking for candidates who've made a significant contribution, we ask for your Tgrade address, plus we ask for your identity. We want to know who we're giving these points to so we don't get Sybil attacked. So you can run 5 validators pretending to be 5 different things, but you only can really earn engagement points on one of the addresses because you have to reveal who you are for the other 4 addresses if you're trying to play a game. So again, we're using identity as a way of putting some boundaries around who can earn what and how it can be gamed. So that's kind of the first layer of proof of engagement. And the second one we deliberated about a lot was on delegation. So delegated proof of stake is widely understood. You delegate your tokens to validate, and in return, you get a share of their rewards and they get your tokens for stake. And you build up a stake to get voting authority. And the stakes are important because you're putting tokens away out of circulation, that secures a chain, because if someone wants to come and attack the chain, they need to buy tokens, and the more people buying puts the price up, and so on. And if you want to control a chain, you need to buy lots of tokens, and that heavy buying signal will just keep putting the price up and up and up and make it too expensive to attack the chain. So that's the principles.
Delegation is a mechanism that's widely understood, widely adopted by numerous blockchain networks to facilitate security and transaction integrity, and also provide a mechanism by which holders of tokens can earn a return. Because by delegating the assets that they hold to validators, they're then able to share in the rewards that validators earn through their activities in securing the network. So that's well understood, and also something that token holders are used to seeing, but that is something that Tgrade has deliberately decided not to support. So delegation is not available within the Tgrade network. So what was the thinking behind taking that approach?
Thinking behind the no delegation was a long back and forth and a very, very lengthy discussion about the pros and cons of delegators. So in theory, a delegator should spend a fair bit of time on due diligence, selecting a number of validators, looking at their performance, seeing how well they operate, how often they get slashed on all sorts of criteria. And in practice, what you get is a rush to the top. They look at the top 5 validators and they stake there. So again, we're looking at concentration of power, because it becomes self-reinforcing, and the delegators are just looking at the top ones, thinking that's the most secure one. And then you also have the validators that do the zero commission, where they don't charge, they don't take anything from the delegators for servicing or running or delegating to them. Most validators will charge a small amount for the operational costs and running of it. Some validators decide not to. So that's called a zero commission attack. That again is to get a lot of people delegating with you, to give you a proportion of voting power. Validators can do this if they have a reasonable stake, so they can get a reasonable income off their stake tokens. But it's not particularly healthy for a chain. So this concentration is something that we didn't particularly like. And really, in the ethos of engagement, there's no real engagement of a token holder by just delegating. They're not actively taking part in the network. So they're getting rewards for something they're not particularly actively involved with. So again, that sort of didn't quite fit in what we wanted. So we thought, well, what happens if I did a bit of a thought experiment to say, well, actually, a validator acting as an agent has also got less skin in the game. So I could actually be a validator with, 100 euros worth of tokens. I could have a couple of million staked in me. Something goes wrong. Whoops. It's the delegators that take the hit with the slashing, not me personally. So yes, I get reputation damage, a little hit on that, but it hasn't actually cost me financially anything. So the whole idea of having that stake there and having it being slashed kind of takes away some of the threat or the skin in the game from a validator. So then we thought, well, actually, a validator acting as an agent could be problematic. There's also some thinking as well, like you look at it and saying, well, imagine an organization that took deposits of people and gave them a return for that. So that's how a savings club started, and maybe a building society and so on. Savings banks basically operate in that business. Would the regulator one day look at validators and say, you look awfully like a deposit mechanism for somebody to earn money. Don't you need a license for that? So that was possibly another threat that we may see, that maybe not now, but 10 years down the line, it could become an issue. So if we're saying no delegators, that could mean that you get a situation where, some innovative team wants to put together a validated service. They've got a really strong background in running data centers. They really understand security on Sentry nodes and all the other things they need to know, but they're not particularly cash rich. So how do they get hold of a stake to compete with everybody else? So that was a question we asked ourselves. So then we said, well, why not have the validators act as principals rather than agents? So let's say I need tokens to run my validator node. Why don't I offer a bilateral loan? I can use some off-chain legal agreements. I can take the tokens that people loan to me. I can stake them. I can make a return. I can offer return to people lending me their tokens, but I am fully responsible for that stake. So that means that I'm going to run my validator node very, very, very carefully. I don't want slashing, because if I do, it's going to cost me money because I need to pay these people back with their tokens. If I'm slash 5%, then that's a real economic hit to me, because I got to then find that 5% in tokens to repay people. So let's have a look, rethink of that was the idea, and say, well, there are other mechanisms for validators with a bit of innovation to be able to raise their stakes through things like bilateral loans. We've covered the delegation discussion on why we chose not to have delegators, and mentioned there the bilateral loans.
Yes. So I think that's very interesting about the way that you talk about principle and agency, and the misalignment of risks and incentives that exist within the current delegation model. So that you have validators who are essentially in a position of agents. They're receiving rewards as principal, but they don't take risk as principal. And as you say, that's a fundamental flaw in the model that's adopted by a number of networks. But then looking at it from the perspective of token holders will still often want to earn a return. And one of the attractive ways of earning a return, particularly in a decentralized environment, is through delegation. So from what you're saying, there will still be opportunities for return generation for token holders, but through a different model. And that is the bilateral loan one. Is that correct?
Exactly. So I think it's more I guess the innovation will happen through more traditional ways of, I need tokens to be able to stake. So there's a business need there, and I need a return for my tokens. It becomes a natural business transaction. Whereas at the moment, it kind of feels a bit weird that I expect a return, so I'm going to have this mechanism where I can just, stake them through some magic and get a return from it, and I don't have to do much for it. Whereas I think you just pause and look at what you're signing when you do a bilateral loan. It's clear on both parties where the obligations and where the returns are.
Absolutely. So that means that in terms of the security of those arrangements, you'd be reliant upon both on-chain and off-chain mechanisms.
Totally, yeah. In the bilateral loan scenario, well, obviously once the validator has the stakes, that does secure the network in the way it's intended. And I guess at some point, say a validator had them all locked up and went bankrupt, there's obviously processes that you can deal with off-chain about the recovery of those funds, and of on and off-chain that will resolve this kind of issue.
So in terms of the innovations that we've talked about from a governance and consensus perspective for Tgrade, we've got sustained community engagement through proof of engagement, which encourages a diverse range of activities that can support an active community, which, as you say, is fundamental to the security, the reliability of a blockchain network, since they're fundamentally they're not just pieces of technical infrastructure, but they're socio-technical as phenomena. And in addition to that, you talked about the additional innovation that prevents whales essentially amassing large amounts of tokens and using that to generate a return, because there are multiple different ways of generating engagement points and limitations on the extent to which stake can be used to monopolize or take an excessive share of those engagement rewards.
Correct.
So in addition to that, what are the other innovations that you've worked on and that are part of how Tgrade operates in terms of governance and consensus?
So I think we're one of the few blockchains that actually has a written constitution. So the written constitution sets out the authority of who does what, the limits of power, what their responsibilities are in a classic constitution. And it was written in a way that I expect it to evolve over time. It will get tested. People will look at this and think, well, okay, let's see how we can evolve this. You know, is it fit for purpose? It should be regularly reviewed. So I think that's the starting point. Secondly, around the launching of the chain, it was really important to us to have a very solid validator base. And what we mean by that is that I think we interviewed well over 100 validators around the world to get a nice fit for Tgrade, for ensuring geographical decentralization. We wanted to ensure that we had different company sizes, some with their own data centers, some using cloud, as a way of really ensuring that we have diversity. And as part of that selection process, we also issued a validator code of conduct. Recipients of basically the tokens that are allocated at launch, it came with an undertaking they had to sign that they agreed to a certain set of rules of conduct, basically, that we expected good behavior, and we codified that. Like I mentioned,
how is that monitored and enforced?
We had early on in the chain, we had an incident where a validator was not really adhering to the spirit of the code of conduct, and we were able to take sanctions through the oversight community. So the oversight community are basically a self-sovereign group. They have the power to slash validators, to jail them, and they have limited mechanisms, which is very clearly set out in the constitution of what they can and can't do. So they were used for that. They are the guys that sets or the team that sets the engagement points and keep an eye on the validators. So we do have discretion they have discretion. The idea is that the voting mechanisms really are recording the consensus they make off chain. So there's a lot of discussions happen off chain between the oversight community members. The decision gets reached, a proposal gets created, and it gets voted on pretty sharpish because we've already done the negotiations. In other governance mechanisms you see on chains, proposals get done, it gets all done and they put out in the public networks as lengthy discussions go on. And you kind of form the consensus through that process, and then it gets voted on, or the voting process happens while that discussion goes on. We felt that it's better to have the discussions first and then put the proposals out in the voting, rather than having those two sort of combined together. So then,
and who are the members, who are the participants of the oversight community?
So we started off with initial set of, I think it's 15 to start with. It shrunk because one or two have disappeared and they've been voted off because they haven't been active. But the idea is that will grow as the chain grows. So it needs to be quite small, quite compact to begin with, because we're setting up process, policies, ways of working. And we needed fairly rapid agreement on things. So, we debate these things quite lengthily, but we do come to conclusions quite reasonably well, considering time zones. And I think there's a lot of scope to expand that, to make it larger, to have a larger pool, to make it less centralized. It's beginnings. It's a process. I think it's a process of decentralization. It's fairly centralized now, but the intent is for it to grow. Additional members come on board, bringing their expertise in, and so on. It makes it stronger.
So then the governance mechanisms are something that are in a state of evolution and development. It's not a static structure. It's something that can adapt as the network grows and the demands of the network and the requirements of the network become more apparent.
Yeah, and the checks and balances to the oversight community are on. We have this thing called an arbiter pool, dispute resolution, another independent set. So if you're a member of the oversight community, you can't be a member of the arbiter group. And the idea is the arbitration is for matters of constitution where there's disputes on, you want to look at interpreting the laws of or the constitution, and you need that independence to be able to have reasoned decisions, to be able to resolve disputes and so on relating to that. And again, I can see that as a first step, and that will evolve in time as a counterbalance to uphold the constitution as we laid it out.
Okay. So you have a constitutional framework to provide guidance on conduct and orderly operation. You then have an oversight community, which essentially is the guardian of that constitution and brings enforcement actions where the oversight community deem appropriate. But then if there are disputes about the actions that the oversight committee take, or disagreements about the interpretation of the constitution, then you have a separate dispute resolution function, the arbiter community that can adjudicate on those disputes as
Absolutely, yeah. And I think these structures are very important for regulated businesses to understand that the chain is well run, is correctly run, it's transparent, and decisions are being made. You can see on block explorers, you can see these proposals going through, who voted them, which addresses voted for them, and so on. So there is transparency about what's been done. The only thing that's not transparent is the discussions internally within the oversight community, which we felt for reasons where you're linking identity to proposals. We don't necessarily want to expose the identity of people, say, for engagement points. We'd rather keep that private, respect their privacy, and then the matters only publicly shared are on the blockchain address. So we're keeping kind of anonymity that way.
So the identity of the actors that might be involved in any particular enforcement action or dispute aren't necessarily publicly available, but the outcome of those processes will
definitely be available. Yeah. I mean,
okay.
It could be that both parties want to make it publicly available who they are and say something about it, but that's their decision. It's not that we want to keep it so that, two blockchain addresses have a dispute. This is what the dispute's about. This is the outcome. And, the plaintiffs aren't identified. They don't need to be.
Yeah, understood. Makes sense.
Yeah.
So if we move on then, after thinking about the governance and consensus aspects, another key component of the Tgrade network and ecosystem is the TGD token.
Yeah.
So can you say a little bit about what it is in terms of its function and also the issuance program for it?
Yeah, I mean, the token itself it's a classic utility token, as in you need it for securing the network through the staking. You need TGD to be able to pay for transactions, for using it for escrow, for basically transacting and interacting on the blockchain. So the cycle is I need TGD to be able to run my wallet, create a smart contract, interact, pay some gas fees. Validators who validate the nodes, validate the network through their nodes, will collect these tokens as rewards. They will then sell them to pay for their operations. Someone else buys them, and that's how the coins basically circulate. So there's there's absolutely no ambiguity about what these things are. The old-fashioned way of looking at it was a multi-use voucher. You can use it again and again and again. It's a token that gets passed on, it has a value, it then gets somebody else, and so on and so forth. And they could be swapped and traded and so on. In terms of issuance, there was a fixed number at launch. 100 million were launched, and then the inflation. We've worked on a fairly low inflationary type model, where loosely based on the Bitcoin model, where there's 6 million tokens a year are minted for block rewards minus 50% of the transaction fees from the year before. So over time, the transaction fees will grow and grow and grow as the chain grows, and the number of blocks of tokens needed to be minted for the block rewards diminishes. So at some point, we'll stop issuing new tokens because the transaction fees and the overall economy will pay for the chain itself, as it were. So it's definitely not a standard percentage inflation like some chains do. Some do like 6%, which compounds and so on. And that means that every token holder is effectively losing money through inflation. We try to minimize that as much as we can through this model, and that's how we're working on that. In terms of allocations, we allocated 25% to the validators. We gave out 20% to the Genesis set. We held 5 back for future bridges and other validator type operations that we needed. We held that in reserve. There was an allocation to Foundation for funding for a grant scheme. There's some given to founders and the team, and to Confio for the contributions they made in setting it up.
What type of allocation is, so you mentioned that one way of earning TGD tokens is through engagement with the community. One of those is through the function of validation, and there's an allocation of tokens that's available to reward validators. What is the size and the structure of the rewards pool that's available for other types of community engagement?
So the block rewards are basically split into three slices of pie. There's 3% of validators, and then there's a split between the engagement pool and a small amount for the community fund. Community fund is made up of basically anyone in the community who has engagement points can vote on certain things, and that's what the community fund is supposed to be used for. Hasn't actually really had much action to begin with because there's not much funds in the community pot, but at some point they'll be able to create open proposals to say we need to spend the money on this, that, and the other as a community. In terms of the engagement points, that proportion of the block rewards goes into the engagement point holders and gets distributed out. So you can see the points as being a distribution mechanism. So, if you're very active and you own 3% of the total number of points, then you get that proportion paid to you and so on. And so even like small engagement point holders will get a small proportion of those block rewards paid out.
Okay, very good. And beyond community engagement, what are the mechanisms that are available for just acquiring tokens through trading marketplaces?
So we're listed on the Osmosis DEX, where there's limited daily volume. So I wouldn't say it's massively liquid in terms of market turnover every day, but the liquidity pool itself is growing. We've got an incentive scheme out on the liquidity pool. So if you contribute to the LP, you get rewards at the moment. That scheme is going to continue for another couple of months. So that's a way of earning TGD by contributing to the liquidity pool. If you want to buy them, that's the route. We are also talking to a provider who can offer a service where you can buy TGD with a credit card. So like that's basically using your basically euros or sterling or dollars, whatever it is, to buy TGD that way. It's not online yet. We're just waiting for the markets to settle down slightly and a price to stabilize.
Sure.
So they're the early ways of doing it at the moment.
And so that means that there are a couple of different ways as well to earn a return on token holdings. So as you say, you can lock up liquidity, and there's a liquidity rewards program that's currently ongoing. And then also, as we mentioned earlier, the alternative to delegation is a potential alternative way of earning a return through bilateral loans.
Absolutely, yeah. So I've been talking to a couple of prospective validators about that, and they're thinking hard about how that could work.
Okay, sounds interesting. And so then, what's the current status of Tgrade?
So basically, it's an interesting one because I guess your traditional blockchain launch comes with a lot of fanfare and quite a lot of activity on the social networks and quite a lot of speculation on the token. We've had a much quieter launch by design because we're less focused on your normal crypto audience. We don't really have DeFi protocols or anything attractive for retail crypto investors, particularly. We're almost like, I guess, in the startup phase. We have an active, fully running blockchain, which is getting better and better by the day through the oversight community understanding more and more what their role is, how the validators work, and so on. And people are starting to build on Tgrade, experiment, create trusted circles, and so on. So, with the objectives of getting businesses on board, we've had one project sort of deliver like an early set of smart contracts that they're looking to deploy at some point. Another one I know is very active in fundraising at the moment to start actually building on the protocol. They could only really start once we launched Tgrade, which was back in June. So they've been doing the rounds, getting quotes off tech companies to build what they need and so on. And the NimLab guys I mentioned, they're building the Vectis wallet. They'll be deploying that at some point later this year and so on. So I think the stage is very much it's a more medium-term play rather than the sugar rush of a launch and excitement. We'll see slowly but surely companies building using that trusted circle infrastructure, using the tools that have deployed on Tgrade, and start building meaningful businesses. And they'll bring all their customers with them, and that will start creating ecosystems.
Yeah, makes sense. So if listeners want to find out more about Tgrade or maybe get involved in the community, find out about different ways of actively contributing to the network and earning engagement points, how can they find out more about that? How can they get involved?
So I guess one of the starting points, maybe the website, tgrade.finance. There is a fairly active Medium blog. Again, Tgrade Finance, look at that one. Follow Tgrade Finance on Twitter. We're also got a Telegram group, Tgrade, and there's Discord as well. So we'll share all the links of that at the end.
Okay, so there are lots of sources currently out there which provide information about different ways you can get involved, and also gives an overview of some of the topics that we talked about in terms of network consensus and governance design, and also some of the tools that are directed very much at building real-world business applications.
Very much so. And I did a couple of blog posts. One was talking about, the rationales, summing up what we talked about today about the basis of Tgrade, why we built it, how with the governance controls, the layers, and so on. And then did more of an example of the types of businesses building on Tgrade, what they're doing. We initially thought it was much, from my background particularly, it was a very obvious market for regulated businesses, financial services. It's turned out that it's not just financial services, but businesses in general. Everyone needs to comply to some extent to anti-money laundering, know your client to begin with, not just financial services. And there are other opportunities to use smart contracts within the context of a trusted circle to issue digital assets, to permission smart contracts to known groups of people where you're linking identity and you're controlling that group and that flow of information around a set of addresses that you've already screened. So that's becoming quite an interesting play, which is why we're emphasizing much more it's a platform for business rather than just a platform for traditional TradFi companies or regulated businesses. Is much broader than that.
Right. So it has versatility and utility beyond traditional financial markets, even though it was the problems and the challenges in traditional financial markets that was the basis for a lot of the design choices made for the Tgrade network.
And in some ways, it's tackling the hardest thing, going for the most difficult industry you can find, getting a blockchain to work within that framework, and then the less regulated businesses, they're still regulated, but not quite as strictly as, say, a financial services firm or a capital markets company. They can operate in this framework. They don't have to strictly implement it the same way as a hedge fund, a bank, or an asset manager may, but they can still use that framework for their business in the ways that they need.
Yeah, particularly as it allows them to control the identity of who they're transacting with. And also, as you said, as a byproduct of that, it also supports the creation of efficient, safe markets, which I think has application in and utility beyond mainstream conventional financial services firms and the banking industry.
Correct. Yeah. And obviously, the other big change we've had, certainly in the European Union, we've had MiCA being published, which is, like it or loathe it, it's bringing regulatory certainty, and that's what business needs. We need to know what are the the regulatory rules or terms of engagement with a blockchain. Now we have that certainty, certainly in the European Union, and there's moves elsewhere with other regulators to give us that certainty. Slowly but surely, the barriers are coming down to business, to be able to adopt blockchain. Maybe 5 years ago, it was the Wild West. We were worried about chains forking, about whether the chain would still exist if it wasn't one of the main ones. Hacks, all sorts of things, and then this massive legal uncertainties. Well, what is a digital asset? No one could tell you back then, but they do now. There's a much better understanding.
Yeah, yeah, and as you say, regulation is coming, and it is a reality that businesses are going to need to be able to comply with when they're using blockchain networks as their technology infrastructure. But nevertheless, you see the benefit to utilizing open permissionless networks as a basis for building those types of businesses, rather than going for the closed permissioned option instead.
Very much so, because I think this kind of model that we built, I don't know whether it's the best way to describe it, but you have like a public permission chain. I think you get the best of both worlds. So the public part is like I mentioned before, extremely robust because it's built in that hostile environment. It's constantly being probed, patched, checked, whatever. We've got the layers, the governance. That makes a very, very, very solid background. And then, the orthodoxy of the permission chains is always, well, build some functionality, get it nice, working richly, then we can turn it, into the public domain. And that's never going to happen. The minute you expose what's being built in a public chain to the open world, then it's like water. It finds its way in, and they will, and so that's never going to be a practical thing. And the scalability of these permission networks, it takes a lot of expense and time to add more nodes. If corporate actions going on and banks got bought up, then they've got who does what with a node and how you uninstall it and so on. And so not really the best way of doing, and not the best way of, blockchains were invented because they were decentralized and they're powerful that way. However, like we've been saying, that layer on top to put some governance around a chain and to give some terms and rules and certainty for business is essential. Otherwise, we end up with some, like I said before, some kind of maritime law, which doesn't really work, and the side effects can be quite devastating for businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Well, thanks very much, Martin. I think that's given a really great introduction and overview to a lot of the different aspects of Tgrade in terms of what you're looking to build, and in terms of the various the deep thinking that's gone into different aspects of the design of a network and how you build a community around it. I think perhaps at another time it would be really interesting to understand some more about the types of businesses that are actually building on Tgrade, and to do perhaps more of a deep dive into what those businesses are, what the challenges are they face, and why they've chosen Tgrade on which to build their technology infrastructure.
Definitely, we'll definitely be back with those, with a couple of businesses and have another discussion.
Okay, great. Look forward to it, Martin.
Right. Thank you.
Thanks very much.